There is a calculation Iran made the day it commissioned the Shahid Bagheri. The United States has 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. The smallest displaces 80,000 tons. The largest, USS Gerald R. Ford, displaces 100,000 tons, roughly the mass of a small mountain, floating, moving at 30 knots, carrying 75 fixed-wing aircraft and a crew of 4,500. Building one costs $13 billion. There are 11 of them. Iran cannot build that. Iran has never pretended it can build that. But Iran made a calculation. You don't need to match the United States carrier for carrier. You need to change the threat calculus. You convert a commercial container ship. You weld on a flight deck. You load it with drones instead of jets. You give it a 22,000 nautical mile range and call it a carrier. You park it in the Gulf of Oman, where it can launch against U.S. Navy assets and Gulf state infrastructure without depending on coastal installations that American cruise missiles can find and destroy in the first hour of any conflict. The calculation was, build the argument that you don't need a supercarrier. Build something that does enough of the same job to matter. Build something Iran can afford. Iran spent 2 years building that argument. It commissioned the result on February 6, 2025 at Bandar Abbas, with IRGC Navy Commander Ali Reza Tangsiri standing at the podium telling the watching world what Iran had achieved. The calculation Iran didn't account for was already in the targeting system of a U.S. Navy destroyer 400 miles away. The Shahid Bagheri lasted 387 days in service. It lasted hours in war. The Shahid Bagheri was not small, 240 meters in length, 41,978 tons displacement. Converted over 2 years from a commercial container ship at the Iran Shipbuilding and Offshore Industries Complex in Bandar Abbas, the same facility that produced Iran's Mujj-class frigates, the same facility that American planners had been watching on satellite since 2022. When Tangsiri stood at the commissioning ceremony on February 6, 2025, he listed what Iran had built: a 180-meter ski-jump flight deck configured for drone operations, 30 fast-attack craft deployable from the interior of the hull, Ababil 3N carrier drones, JAS 313 stealth drones, Bell 206 helicopters, Me-171 transport helicopters, 8 Nur cruise anti-ship missiles, 222 multi-purpose missiles, a 30mm automatic cannon, an operational range of 22,000 nautical miles, enough to circumnavigate the globe without refueling. A ship that could remain at sea for a full year without returning to port. A hospital, a gym, a soccer field. He called it Iran's power of deterrence at sea. He said it could travel independently for up to a year. He said it changed the equation. He was not entirely wrong about what it was built to do. The Shahid Bagheri was not an aircraft carrier in the American sense. It had no catapult system, no arrested recovery, no capacity to operate fast jets against peer opposition. What it had was something more targeted: the ability to take Iran's drone swarm capability, the asymmetric weapon Iran had spent a decade developing and deploying against U.S. assets from Yemen to Iraq and projected oceanic distances from shore, to make the drone threat mobile. To make it a problem that followed American assets rather than waited for them to come within range of a fixed Iranian coastline. In the weeks before the war, the ship was doing exactly that. Stationed in the Gulf of Oman, east of the Strait of Hormuz, operating as a forward launch platform for IRGC drone operations targeting U.S. Navy ships and Gulf state military installations. Not a static target at a pier. A mobile weapons system at sea, already executing its mission. That was the threat picture at CENTCOM on the evening of February 27, 2026. That was the target picture on USS Thomas Hudner on the same evening. The USS Thomas Hudner is DDG-116, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, 509 feet of precision-guided lethality, built around the Mk-41 vertical launch system. 96 cells, standard missiles for air defense, ASROC anti-submarine rockets, and Tomahawk cruise missiles, the Block V maritime strike variant, carrying a 1,000-pound warhead, navigating via terrain following GPS guidance, reaching targets 1,000 miles distant with a circular error probability measured in single-digit meters. The Thomas Hudner had been operating in the Arabian Sea as part of the USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group's surface warfare screen for 11 days before the war started. 11 days of positioning, of intelligence reporting, of target packages being refined and updated as U.S. and Israeli planning moved from preparation to execution. The fire control coordinator aboard the Thomas Hudner, a lieutenant commander on his second deployment, had been tracking the Shahid Bagheri's position since February 25th. 3 days of continuous passive observation. The target was large, slow, and entirely predictable. A 240-meter hull running a consistent patrol pattern in a defined operating area does not generate a difficult targeting problem. It generates a fire control solution that the system updates every 90 seconds and that does not materially change from one watch rotation to the next. On the evening of February 27th, the lieutenant commander reviewed the solution one final time. Course, speed, bearing, range. The Shahid Bagheri was where it had been for 3 days. It would be where it was tomorrow. The Tomahawk would find it regardless. The execute order arrived in the pre-dawn hours of February 28th. Encrypted. He read it, confirmed weapons release authority with his commanding officer, and turned to the fire control team. One shot, one target, bearing southwest. The Tomahawk left the launch cell in the opening hours of Operation Epic Fury. At the same moment, U.S. and Israeli airstrikes were dismantling Iran's air defense network across the mainland. The same moment the Supreme Leader's compound in Tehran was being struck. The same moment Iranian early warning radar installations were going dark from Isfahan to Kermanshah. Aboard the Shahid Bagheri, the pre-dawn watch was routine. Forced to sea state. The ship was running its assigned patrol pattern in the Gulf of Oman, 400 miles east of Bandar Abbas, operating without tactical alert. No indication that the war had started, no acoustic contact report from the surface search radar, no emergency traffic from naval headquarters that no longer had the command infrastructure to send it. The watch officer on the bridge was logging a position report. Engineers were cycling through the overnight maintenance checklist. Some of the crew's 340 men had come topside in the relative cool before dawn. The Tomahawk flies at low altitude. Subsonic. Terrain following. Radar cross-section smaller than a seagull. There is no acoustic warning. No visual signature against a dark sea. The ship's surface search radar was not designed to track an inbound cruise missile at low altitude in ground clutter. And even if it had been, the warning time from radar acquisition to impact at terminal approach speed is measured in seconds, not the minutes required to reach general quarters from a peacetime watch rotation. The Shahid Bagheri's crew did not know the war had started. They did not know that Bandar Abbas was burning 400 miles to the west. They did not know that the naval headquarters responsible for issuing their operational orders had been struck in the opening salvo. They did not know that the Thomas Hudner's fire control team had been tracking their ship for 3 days. The first indication they had that any of this was true was the warhead. The Tomahawk's 1,000-pound payload detonated against the Shahid Bagheri's hull in the opening hours of February 28th. The 180-meter flight deck that had carried Ababil, 3 in drones, and Jess, 313 stealth aircraft began to burn. The drone fuel stores that Iran had loaded for forward projection operations accelerated the fire beyond what the ship's damage control teams, pulled from sleep with no warning, no battle preparation, no functioning communication to a naval command structure that no longer existed, could address in the time available. CENTCOM released satellite footage. The image shows the Shahid Bagheri as a thermal mass against dark water, 240 meters of burning hull, the flight deck distinguishable from the superstructure by the intensity of the fire where the drone fuel had caught. The ship that was supposed to remain at sea for a year without refueling would not survive its first day at war. The General Dan Kane said it at the Pentagon podium, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to reporters. The first shooters at sea were Tomahawks unleashed by the United States Navy, which closed in on Iranian naval forces and began to conduct strikes across the southern flank in Iran. Not a supporting action, not a secondary effort. The first shooters. The Thomas Hudner's Tomahawk was the opening sentence of the U.S. Navy's statement in Operation Epic Fury. On March 2nd, for days into the war, as the Shahid Bagheri sat at the bottom of the Gulf of Oman, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps went on state media and announced to the Iranian public that it had struck USS Abraham Lincoln with 4 ballistic missiles. Read that again slowly. Iran's carrier was already at the bottom of the sea, and Iran was announcing to its people that it had sunk America's carrier. The IRGC statement was specific. For ballistic missiles, USS Abraham Lincoln hit. Iran's press read it as the war turning. Iranian state television ran it as confirmation that the regime's weapons could reach the most protected naval asset in American history. Families in Tehran who had sons in the IRGC believed, on the morning of March 2nd, that their country had struck a blow against the most powerful navy on Earth. Here is what USS Abraham Lincoln was actually doing at that moment. It was launching aircraft. F divided by a -18 Super Hornets were recovering and launching in continuous cycle from the flight deck. The strike group was conducting combat operations against Iranian targets. The ship's commanding officer had not issued a damage control report because there was nothing to report. Every system aboard, propulsion, weapons, aviation, communications, was operational. The Lincoln had not been hit. It had not come close to being hit. It was, at the moment Iran announced its destruction, one of the most aggressively operational warships on the planet. CENTCOM's response came in 14 words. The Lincoln was not hit. The missiles launched didn't even come close. And then the sentence that collapsed Iran's entire information operation. The only carrier that has been hit is the Shahid Bagheri, an Iranian drone carrier. Iran had stood in front of its own people and announced a victory over American naval power at the precise moment that American naval power had already destroyed the only carrier Iran possessed. The ship Iran spent 2 years building to change the threat calculus. The ship that was supposed to project drone warfare globally. The ship that was supposed to prove that a sanctioned nation could build something that mattered at sea. It was burning on the bottom of the Gulf of Oman when Iran announced it had sunk the Lincoln. This is not a coincidence of timing. This is what a regime looks like when it cannot tell its population the truth about what is happening to its military. Because the truth is the systematic destruction of everything Iran spent decades building. The claim about the Lincoln was not an intelligence failure. It was a decision. Tell the story that keeps the population inside the narrative of Iranian power. Tell it regardless of what the satellite imagery shows. Tell it regardless of what CENTCOM confirms. Tell it regardless of what burned and what didn't. 2 carriers, 1 claim, 1 truth. Iran chose which one to announce. Here is the math Iran's calculation required to work. The Shahid Bagheri cost 2 years of construction and conversion work. It cost the institutional effort of every Iranian naval engineer who worked on the project, every IRGC officer trained to operate it, every procurement official who sourced components under the pressure of international sanctions that made each acquisition a separate problem to solve. Call it $400 million in total program cost. A conservative estimate for a 41,000-ton vessel with a full drone air wing and electronic warfare suite built under sanctions without access to Western supply chains. Against that investment, the United States Navy expended 1 Tomahawk. The Block V Maritime Strike variant costs approximately $2 million per unit. Do the math. $400 million versus $2 million. 2 years of construction versus the flight time of a single cruise missile. Iran's entire theory of cost-effective asymmetric naval power. The argument that a converted carrier changes the threat calculus without requiring a $13 billion nuclear supercarrier required the cost-exchange ratio to favor Iran. It required that the investment be difficult to neutralize, expensive to counter, tactically meaningful before it could be destroyed. None of those requirements survived contact with the Thomas Hudner's fire control system. Admiral Brad Cooper said it at his CENTCOM briefing on Day 4. 2 days ago, the Iranian regime had 11 ships in the Gulf of Oman. Today they have 0. He was not describing a degraded navy. He was describing the completed first phase of a campaign designed, per the explicit public statements of both the Secretary of War and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, to eliminate Iranian naval capability as a functional institution. Not degrade it, eliminate it. The Shahid Bagheri was the highest profile casualty of that campaign. Not because it posed the greatest tactical threat. Iran's Kilo-class submarines and IRGC fast boat swarms were the more operationally dangerous elements of the naval order of battle. The Bagheri mattered because it was Iran's public argument made physical. The argument that asymmetric naval power was viable, that a sanctioned nation could project maritime force globally, that the United States did not have an answer to the converted carrier. The United States had an answer. It was already in the air before the Shahid Bagheri's crew knew the war had started. The Shahid Bagheri is at the bottom of the Gulf of Oman. The tactical outcome is recorded. But three things came out of that fire on March 2nd that no one at CENTCOM has publicly addressed. First, the 340-man question. The Shahid Bagheri was a large ship with a large crew. It was struck with no warning, no battle preparation, no functioning naval command structure to issue orders. In the pre-dawn hours of a war its crew did not yet know had started. The United States has not released casualty figures. Iran has not confirmed crew losses. Somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, on the morning of February 28th, 340 men were aboard a ship that was on fire and had no warning. What happened to them? How many were recovered? How many were not? How many families in Bandar Abbas and Tehran are waiting for information that neither their government nor ours has provided? Is a question that the official statements on both sides have carefully avoided answering. Second, the information collapse and what comes after it. The gap between what Iran told its people on March 2nd and what CENTCOM confirmed on the same day is not a propaganda footnote. It is a window into the decision-making of a regime conducting a war while simultaneously managing a domestic population that has been increasingly resistant to the regime's version of events since the January 2026 protests. When the truth about the Shahid Bagheri reaches the Iranian street, through social media, through the diaspora, through the satellite imagery that anyone with a phone can now access, what that does to a population already watching its infrastructure burn and its leadership structure collapse is a question no analyst at CENTCOM can answer. Because it is not a military question. It is a question about what happens to a regime when its people see the gap between the story they were told and the ship at the bottom of the sea. Third, the converted carrier doctrine that Iran has not abandoned. The Shahid Bagheri was one of 4 converted vessels Iran operates on the same principle. The Iris Shahid Madavi, the Iris Shahid Radaki, the Iris Makran. All of them are built on the same logic. Commercial hulls converted into military platforms, launching drones and fast attack craft, projecting IRGC capability beyond the Iranian coastline. The Shahid Bagheri's destruction does not retire that doctrine. It educates it. Iran now knows exactly how exposed a large, slow-converted hull is to a U.S. Navy Tomahawk in the opening hours of a conflict. What that knowledge does to the 3 remaining converted platforms, and whether any of them survive the coming days of Operation Epic Fury, is a question that has not yet been publicly answered. But the Thomas Hudner's fire control coordinator has had 3 days since the Bagheri went down, and the targeting system updates every 90 seconds. Iran spent 2 years building its argument. It commissioned the result on February 6, 2025, with an admiral at the podium and cameras rolling and the IRGC calling it Iran's power of deterrence at sea. On March 2, 2026, that same regime stood in front of its people and announced it had sunk America's carrier. Their carrier was already at the bottom of the sea. If you want to understand what comes next, what Iran does when its navy no longer exists, when its people see the gap between the story and the wreckage, when 3 more converted hulls are somewhere in the Gulf of Oman, with a targeting solution that hasn't materially changed in 3 days, subscribe. Because the next 72 hours will not be quiet. Stay vigilant. Stay informed.